Melissa Dawson was 16 years old when her father's fist connected with her jaw and sent her stumbling backward into the November cold, her mother watching from the kitchen window with a dish towel still clutched in her hands. She was 17 weeks pregnant. She had $43 in her coat pocket, a backpack with 3 changes of clothes, and nowhere in the world to go. She walked for 22 minutes through the freezing streets of Calvary, Tennessee, until she found herself standing before the boarded-up doors of St. Catherine's, a church that had been abandoned since 1987 when the congregation dwindled to nothing and the diocese decided the building wasn't worth saving. She expected to find emptiness inside, dust and decay, and the hollow echo of her own breathing. What she didn't expect was the woman sitting in the third pew from the back. She, wrapped in a wool blanket that had seen better decades, who looked up at the sound of the creaking door and said, without any surprise at all, "Well, I was wondering when you'd get here." The town of Calvary sat in a valley between 2 ridges of the Cumberland Plateau, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business and kept track of it in the ledgers of their memory with the precision of accountants. Population 4,200, though that number had been shrinking for as long as anyone could remember, young people leaving for Nashville or Knoxville or anywhere that offered more than the paper mill and the chicken processing plant. Main Street ran for 6 blocks and held a hardware store that had been owned by the same family for 4 generations, a diner called May's that served breakfast until 11 and judgment until closing. And 3 churches for a population that couldn't fill one. The Presbyterian Church was the largest, painted white with a steeple that caught the morning light and a congregation of respectable families who sat in the same pews their grandparents had occupied. The Baptist Church was smaller but louder, their Sunday services spilling out into the parking lot when Pastor Ricky got going on Hellfire and Redemption. And then there was St. Catherine's, the Catholic Church that had never quite fit in this Protestant valley. Its stone walls and stained glass windows, a reminder of immigrant families who had come to work the mines a century ago and whose descendants had mostly moved away or converted or simply stopped believing in anything at all. Melissa grew up in a yellow house on Birch Street, the 3rd house from the corner, either with a porch swing that creaked and a dogwood tree in the front yard that bloomed white every April. Her father, Earl Dawson, worked as a foreman at the paper mill, a position he had held for 19 years and defended with the kind of rigid authority that men mistake for leadership. He was 47 years old in the autumn of 1994, his hair gone gray at the temples, his shoulders still broad from the physical work of his youth, his hands calloused, and his heart hardened by disappointments he never spoke about, but wore in the set of his jaw and the quickness of his temper. He had married Melissa's mother, Darlene, when she was 19 and he was 24, and whatever tenderness had existed between them in those early years had been worn down to a polished indifference. In 2 people sharing a house and a daughter, and an unspoken agreement to never discuss anything that mattered. Darlene worked part-time at the library, shelving books and avoiding eye contact with the women who had opinions about her husband, about her daughter, about the way she seemed to shrink into herself whenever Earl raised his voice. She was a beautiful woman once, people said, and the past tense was always the cruelest part of the sentence. Melissa was their only child, though not for lack of trying in those early years, and then not for lack of relief in the later ones. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's stubborn mouth, a combination that meant she was pretty enough to attract attention and willful enough to resent it. She was a good student when she bothered to apply herself, which was rarely. Her intelligence expressing itself instead in the sharp observations she made about her teachers and neighbors, the kind of observations that earned her a reputation for being difficult when the same comments from a boy would have been called clever. She worked at the Dairy Queen on weekends, scooping soft serve and dodging the wandering hands of men who thought the uniform gave them permission, saving her money in a mason jar she kept hidden in her closet because she had learned early that anything left in plain sight in the Dawson house was subject to her father's inspection and commentary. She was 16 years old in the fall of 1994, a junior at Calvary High School, and she had been seeing Marcus Webb for 7 months, a relationship conducted in back seats and borrowed bedrooms, in whispered phone calls after her parents went to sleep, and in the back booth at May's Diner, where no one who knew her father would see them together. Marcus was 19, which should have been warning enough, a part-time mechanic at his uncle's garage, with a smile that made promises his character couldn't keep. He had graduated from Calvary High 2 years prior, barely, and had spent the intervening time working just enough to afford gas for his truck and drinks at the bar, one county over, where they didn't check IDs too carefully. He told Melissa she was different from the other girls, that she understood him, that they were going to leave this town together and start a real life somewhere else. And she believed him because she wanted to believe him, because belief was easier than looking clearly at the evidence of who he actually was. He was handsome in the way that fades quickly after 25, with dark eyes and a careless confidence that read as exciting when you were 16, and trapped in a town where nothing ever happened. She gave herself to him in the back of his truck on a night in July when the cicadas were so loud you could barely hear yourself think, and she remembered afterward the way he had rolled over and lit a cigarette without looking at her, and how she had stared up at the stars through the truck's dirty rear window and tried to convince herself that what she felt was love. She missed her period in late August. She missed it again in September. By October, she was throwing up in the bathroom at school between second and third period, and the girls who heard her through the stall door were already spreading rumors before she had finished rinsing out her mouth. She bought a pregnancy test at the pharmacy in Greenfield 40 minutes away, paying cash and keeping her head down, and she took it in the bathroom of a gas station and watched the two pink lines appear with a kind of detached horror, as if she were watching it happen to someone else, some other foolish girl who had believed a boy's pretty lies. She was 17 weeks pregnant before she finally told Marcus, sitting in his truck outside the garage where he worked, her hands shaking so badly she had to press them against her thighs to keep them still. He listened. He nodded. He said they would figure it out together, that everything was going to be fine, and then he drove her home, and she didn't hear from him for 3 days. When she finally got him on the phone, he told her the baby probably wasn't his, that she had probably been messing around with other guys, and that he wasn't going to ruin his life for some girl who couldn't keep her legs closed. The line went dead. She called back 4 times. He never answered again. Her mother noticed the weight gain first, the subtle thickening at her waist that Melissa tried to hide with baggy sweaters and strategic posture. Darlene didn't say anything for 2 weeks, just watched her daughter with those tired, knowing eyes that had seen too much and said too little for too many years. And then one evening in early November, while Earl was working late at the mill, she sat down beside Melissa on the porch swing and asked her directly, no preamble, no gentle lead-up, "How far along are you?" It wasn't a question. Melissa considered lying. She opened her mouth to deny everything, and to claim it was just water weight, just stress eating, just anything other than the truth. But something in her mother's face, some flicker of what might have been compassion, or might have been resignation, made her close her mouth again. She said 17 weeks. She said she was sorry. She said Marcus wasn't going to help. Darlene was quiet for a long moment, the swing creaking beneath them, the November wind carrying the smell of wood smoke from someone's chimney. Then she said, "We have to tell your father." And in those 6 words, Melissa heard her entire future collapsing. Earl came home at 7:15 that evening, the same time he always came home, hanging his jacket on the hook by the door, washing his hands at the kitchen sink, sitting down at the head of the table where his dinner was already waiting. Darlene had made meatloaf, his favorite, moan as if the meal might somehow soften what was coming. Melissa sat across from him, not eating, her stomach too knotted to consider food, her hands clasped in her lap like a penitent waiting for judgment. Darlene stood by the stove, wiping the same spot on the counter over and over, and finally, Earl looked up from his plate and asked what was wrong with everyone, why they were acting so strange, why nobody was talking. Darlene looked at Melissa. Melissa looked at her hands. And then, because there was no other way, because the silence was worse than any words could be, she said, "I'm pregnant." She said, "I'm keeping it." She said, "Marcus won't help." She said, "I'm sorry." The silence that followed lasted exactly 11 seconds. She counted them, each one stretching longer than the one before, the tick of the kitchen clock suddenly deafening, and the scrape of Earl's fork against his plate as he set it down with exaggerated care. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she almost couldn't hear him. He said, "Get out." He said, "Get out of my house." He said, "I don't have a daughter anymore." She thought it was a figure of speech at first, the kind of thing fathers said when they were angry, the kind of thing that would blow over by morning once everyone had calmed down. She started to explain, started to apologize again, started to tell him that she had nowhere to go, that it was November, that she was 16 years old and pregnant and scared. She was still talking when he stood up from the table. She was still talking when he grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the front door. When she was still talking when his fist connected with her jaw and the world went white and then red, and then she was on her back on the front porch, tasting blood, looking up at the man who had raised her and seeing nothing in his eyes that resembled love or even recognition. He threw her backpack after her. He slammed the door. She lay there for a full minute, maybe two, the cold November air seeping through her clothes, the blood from her split lip dripping onto the weathered porch boards. When she finally sat up, she saw her mother standing at the kitchen window watching, the dish towel still clutched in her hands, and she waited for the door to open again, waited for her mother to come out and help her up and bring her back inside. The curtain fell closed. The light went out. The door stayed shut. Zarm, she walked because there was nothing else to do. She walked because if she stopped moving, she would start screaming, and she was afraid of what would come out if she opened her mouth. The streets of Calvary were empty at 8 p.m. on a Tuesday night, the good citizens of this good town safely inside their good houses, and Melissa moved through them like a ghost, invisible and untethered. Her jaw throbbed where her father's fist had landed. Her lip had stopped bleeding, but was swelling rapidly, and she could feel the tender bruise spreading across her cheek. She had no destination in mind, no plan, no idea what came next. She couldn't go to Marcus. She couldn't go to friends because the friends she had were casual acquaintances at best, girls who would gossip about her situation before offering help. She couldn't go to the police because what would she tell them? That her father had hit her, that she was pregnant and homeless. And what then? Foster care at 16? A group home somewhere with girls who had harder stories and harder fists than her father's? She walked past May's diner, still open, the warm light spilling out onto the sidewalk. And she thought about going in, sitting in a booth, ordering coffee just to have somewhere to be. But she knew what would happen. Someone would recognize her. Someone would ask questions. Word would get back to her father. She kept walking. She passed the Presbyterian church first, its white steeple catching the streetlight, and she considered trying the doors, but she knew they would be locked. Knew that churches in small towns locked their doors against exactly the kind of desperate person she had become. She passed the Baptist church with its hand-painted sign advertising Sunday services and a youth group that met on Wednesdays, and she remembered attending vacation Bible school there when she was 8, drinking red Kool-Aid and making crosses out of popsicle sticks, and the memory seemed to belong to someone else's life entirely. She kept walking, past the edge of downtown, past the last streetlight, into the darkness where the town gave way to overgrown lots and abandoned buildings and the remnants of businesses that had failed a decade ago. And that's when she saw St. Catherine's, sitting alone at the end of a street that had no other purpose anymore, its stone walls blackened by years of weather and neglect, and its windows dark except where broken glass let the moonlight through, its heavy wooden doors nailed shut with boards that had been put up so long ago they had begun to rot. She didn't know why she stopped. She didn't know why this building, of all the buildings she had passed, seemed to pull at something inside her. She had never been Catholic, had never set foot inside St. Catherine's when it was still a functioning church, had no connection to this place beyond the fact that it existed on the outskirts of a town that wanted to forget about it. But something about the way it sat there, abandoned and forgotten, and still somehow standing, spoke to her in a language she understood. She was abandoned too. She was forgotten too. Maybe there was room for her inside. She walked around to the side of the building, her sneakers crunching on dead leaves and broken glass, until she found a window where the boards had fallen away, leaving a gap just wide enough for her body to slip through. She didn't think about what she was doing. She didn't weigh the risks. She simply climbed inside, scraping her palms on the rough stone, dropping down into the darkness of what had once been a supply room. And she stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence, smelling the dust and decay, and something else underneath it, something that might have been incense, or might have been memory. The church was dark, but not entirely lightless. Moonlight filtered through the broken windows, casting strange patterns on the warped floorboards and the overturned pews. Melissa moved carefully through the nave, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness, yet her hands brushing against cold stone walls. The altar was still there, covered in dust, a few scattered hymnals rotting on the floor beside it. The stations of the cross still hung on the walls, their painted figures faded and peeling, Christ carrying his burden through 14 stages of suffering while the faithful watched and did nothing. She thought about that, about watching and doing nothing, about her mother at the kitchen window. She sat down in one of the pews that was still upright, third from the back on the left side, and she wrapped her arms around herself and let herself cry for the first time since her father's fist had landed. She cried for her baby, for the life she had imagined and would never have, for the boy who had lied to her, and the father who had hit her, and the mother who had watched it happen. And she cried until she had nothing left, and then she sat in the silence and wondered what came next. That's when she heard the voice. "Well, I was wondering when you'd get here." Melissa's heart stopped. Her body went rigid, every muscle tensed to run, though where she would run to, she had no idea. The voice had come from the darkness behind her, from the shadows at the back of the church where the moonlight couldn't reach. She turned slowly, her hands gripping the pew in front of her so hard her knuckles went white, and she saw a shape moving in the darkness, a figure rising from another pew, a face emerging into the pale light. It was an old woman, 70 at least, maybe older, with white hair that hung in tangled strands around a face that had weathered enough years to have its own geography of lines and shadows. She was wrapped in a wool blanket that looked like it might have been army surplus in another decade, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints had stopped cooperating long ago. Her eyes, though, her eyes were sharp and clear and looked at Melissa with a recognition that made no sense, as if she had been expecting exactly this, exactly now, exactly her. The old woman sat down in the pew across the aisle, settling herself with a sigh that spoke of bone-deep exhaustion, and she studied Melissa's face in the moonlight, taking in the swelling lip, the bruised cheek, the terror and the grief, and the stubborn refusal to look away. The old woman said, "My name is Ruth." She said, "I've been living here for 7 years, ever since my own children decided I was more trouble than I was worth." She said, "Now, you look like you could use a cup of tea, which is fortunate, because I've got a camp stove in the sacristy and a stubborn belief that tea fixes everything except the things it doesn't." And then she stood up, slowly, with the careful movements of someone who had learned not to trust her own body, and she held out her hand to Melissa as if they were meeting at a church social, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. Melissa looked at that hand. She looked at the old woman's face. She thought about running, about climbing back out the window and taking her chances on the street. But Ruth's hand was steady, and her eyes were kind, and the church was warmer than the November night, and Melissa was so tired, so impossibly tired, that running seemed like something that happened to other people, even people with energy and hope and somewhere to go. She took Ruth's hand. The sacristy was a small room behind the altar, its original purpose long since obscured by the necessities of survival. Ruth had set up a kind of camp there, a sleeping bag on an old mattress that she had dragged in from somewhere, a camp stove that ran on propane canisters she scavenged from the hardware store's dumpster, a plastic tub of supplies that included tea bags and crackers and powdered soup and other provisions that could survive without refrigeration. There was a battery-powered lantern that cast a warm yellow glow, and a stack of books in one corner, their spines cracked from rereading, and a photograph in a tarnished frame that showed a younger Ruth standing beside 2 children who looked about college age, everyone smiling, everyone together, everyone happy. Ruth saw Melissa looking at the photograph and didn't explain. She just filled a dented kettle with water from a plastic jug and set it on the camp stove to boil, and she rummaged through her supplies until she found a clean cup and a tea bag that claimed to be chamomile, and she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this many times before, who had welcomed other strays into this sanctuary of dust and shadows. Ruth made tea. Ruth listened while Melissa talked, haltingly at first, then faster, the whole story pouring out of her in a flood she couldn't stop. Marcus and his lies, the pregnancy, her mother's knowing eyes, her father's fist, the walk through town, the window, the darkness, the crying. Ruth didn't interrupt. She didn't offer advice. She didn't say everything would be okay, which Melissa appreciated because she was so tired of people lying to her, so tired of pretty words that meant nothing. When Melissa finally ran out of words, Ruth sipped her own tea and was quiet for a long moment. And then she said, "You can stay here tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out tomorrow. Tonight, you need to sleep." Melissa wanted to argue, wanted to explain that she couldn't just stay in an abandoned church, that she had to make a plan, that she had to figure out what to do about the baby, and school, and money, and all the impossible problems that were waiting for her. But her body had other ideas. The tea was warm in her stomach, and the sleeping bag Ruth had pulled from her supplies was soft, and the exhaustion was pulling her down like a current she couldn't fight. She slept, for the first time in weeks. She slept without dreaming. The days that followed blurred together in a rhythm that was part survival and part education. Ruth was a teacher by nature, though she had never stood in front of a classroom, and she taught Melissa the things she needed to know: how to heat water without starting a fire that would attract attention, how to slip in and out of the church through the window without being seen, where to find food the grocery stores threw away just because it was past its sell-by date, how to stay warm when the temperature dropped below freezing, how to keep clean with nothing but cold water and a sliver of soap. She taught her practical things, but she also taught her other things, harder things. Things Melissa didn't know she needed to learn, until Ruth said them out loud. But she taught her that shame was a weapon other people used to control you, and you didn't have to pick it up. She taught her that forgiveness wasn't something you gave to the person who hurt you. It was something you gave to yourself, permission to put down the weight and move on. She taught her that the world was full of people who would decide your worth based on the worst thing that had ever happened to you, and your job was to refuse to believe them. Ruth's story came out in pieces over the weeks that followed, fragments offered without chronology, a jigsaw puzzle that Melissa slowly assembled. Ruth had been a nurse for 37 years, had worked in hospitals and clinics and nursing homes, had held more dying hands than she could count, had brought more babies into the world than she could remember. Or she had been married to a man named Harold for 41 years, a good man, a quiet man, a man who made her laugh and held her when she cried, and died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning while she was at work. That was 12 years ago. Her children, the ones in the photograph, had been attentive at first, visiting on weekends, calling to check in. But Harold had left debts, and Ruth had left the workforce to care for him in his final years, and there was no pension, and barely any savings. And when Ruth's health began to fail, when she needed hip surgery she couldn't afford, and medications that cost more than her rent, her children had done the calculations and found the numbers wanting. They didn't throw her out, nothing so dramatic. They simply stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped answering when she reached out. Or they let her slip through the cracks of their own lives, too busy, too burdened, too convinced that someone else would handle it. By the time Ruth realized no one was coming, she had lost her apartment and most of her possessions and what remained of her belief in the people she had raised. She found St. Catherine's the same way Melissa would find it 7 years later, walking the streets with nowhere to go, looking for shelter from a January cold that would kill you if you let it. She had been living here ever since, invisible to a town that didn't want to see her, surviving on the margins of a community that had forgotten she existed. She knew the rhythms of Calvary better than the people who still lived in heated houses with running water, knew which dumpsters were emptied when, which churches left their doors unlocked for prayer, which public bathrooms were safe and which were not. She had built a life from scraps and stubbornness, and she had made peace with the solitude, with the silence, with the weight of being utterly alone in the world. And then Melissa had climbed through the window, and Ruth had looked at her face and seen something she recognized, and she had understood that the universe had given her one more purpose before she was done. Winter came hard that year, the temperatures dropping into the single digits by December, ice forming on the inside of the church windows, the cold seeping through the stone walls until no amount of blankets could keep it out entirely. Ruth taught Melissa how to layer clothing, how to stuff newspaper into her coat for insulation, how to exercise in place to keep her blood moving when the cold got too deep. And they huddled together on the coldest nights, sharing body heat like animals, Ruth's aged bones pressed against Melissa's swelling belly. Ruth talked about the baby in those dark hours, talked about the births she had attended as a nurse, the thousands of deliveries she had witnessed. She explained what Melissa's body was doing, how the baby was growing, what she might feel in the weeks ahead. She didn't try to prepare her for the pain of labor. There was no way to prepare for that. But she told her what to expect, step by step, and her voice was so calm and so sure that Melissa almost believed everything would be okay. The baby was due in April. Melissa marked the days on a calendar Ruth had salvaged from somewhere, crossing off each one with a pencil stub, watching her due date approach with a mixture of terror and anticipation. So she knew she couldn't give birth here, in an abandoned church with no running water and no electricity, and no one to help, except a 73-year-old woman with her own health problems. She knew she needed a hospital, needed a doctor, needed to exist in the system long enough to bring this child safely into the world. Ruth knew it too. In February, when Melissa was 30 weeks pregnant, Ruth sat her down and told her it was time. Time to go to the county health department. Time to apply for Medicaid. Time to make herself visible again, at least enough to get the care she needed. Melissa was terrified. She was still a minor, still technically her parents' responsibility, still afraid that someone would drag her back to the yellow house on Birch Street or worse. But Ruth walked with her to the health department office in Greenfield, 40 minutes away, holding her hand in the waiting room, helping her fill out the forms, vouching for her when the social worker asked questions about her living situation. Ruth told them Melissa was staying with her, an old family friend, and somehow the social worker believed it or chose not to question it too closely. By the end of the day, Melissa had a Medicaid card and an appointment for prenatal care, and something that felt almost like hope. The months that followed were the strangest of her life, living between worlds. The hidden world of St. Catherine's with its dust and shadows and Ruth's quiet wisdom, and the official world of doctor's appointments and clinic visits and forms to sign. She took a GED class at the community college in Greenfield, paying for the test with money Ruth had saved over years of scavenging. She walking 3 miles each way because they didn't have a car, and the bus ran twice a day if you were lucky. She studied at night by lantern light, Ruth quizzing her on algebra and grammar, both of them laughing when they got the answers wrong. She passed the GED on her first attempt, just barely, and she held the certificate in her hands and cried because it felt like proof that she still existed, that she could still do things, that she wasn't just a ruined girl waiting for the world to finish destroying her. The baby came on April 19th, 1995, 3 days early. Melissa woke at 2 a.m. with a pain that wrapped around her lower back and squeezed, and she knew, before she was fully conscious, that this was it, the moment she had been dreading and longing for in equal measure. Ruth was beside her immediately, pressing a hand to her belly, when timing the contractions with an old watch that hadn't kept accurate time in years. The contractions were 8 minutes apart, then 6, then 5, and by the time they made it to the emergency room in Greenfield, Ruth having flagged down a passing car, having convinced a stranger to drive them at 4 a.m., having held Melissa's hand the entire way, she was fully dilated, and the baby was coming whether anyone was ready or not. The labor lasted 4 hours. Melissa screamed and cried and begged for it to stop, and Ruth held her hand and wiped her forehead and told her she was doing beautifully, that she was stronger than she knew, that the baby was almost here. And then, at 8:43 in the morning, while the April sun streamed through the hospital window and the machines beeped their steady rhythms, a baby girl slid into the world, slick and red and screaming. And Melissa held her against her chest and felt something break open inside her, something that had been locked away since the night her father's fist landed, something that she hadn't known she still possessed. She named her Grace. Ruth stayed at the hospital that first day, sitting in the chair beside Melissa's bed, holding Grace with the practiced ease of someone who had held 10,000 newborns. But she looked tired, Melissa noticed, more tired than usual. Her face was pale, and she kept pressing her hand to her chest as if something hurt, and when Melissa asked if she was okay, Ruth just smiled and said she was fine, just old, just worn out from all the excitement. She said she would go back to St. Catherine's to rest, and she would return in the morning when Melissa was discharged. She kissed Melissa's forehead. She kissed Grace's tiny fist. She walked out of the hospital room with the careful, deliberate steps that Melissa had learned to recognize as pain disguised as dignity. She didn't come back the next morning. She didn't come back at all. They found Ruth 3 days later, lying in her sleeping bag in the sacristy of St. Catherine's, her hands folded across her chest, as if she had arranged herself for viewing, her face peaceful in a way it never was when she was awake. The official cause of death was a heart attack, the medical examiner said, probably in her sleep, probably painless. Melissa didn't believe the painless part, but she held on to it anyway because she needed to believe something. She stood at the graveside service. There was no money for a funeral, just a county burial in a plot with a numbered marker, holding Grace against her shoulder, watching them lower Ruth into the ground, and she understood that she was alone again, that the one person who had chosen her, who had saved her, who had taught her how to survive, was gone. She was 17 years old. She had a newborn daughter and a GED and $112 in cash and nowhere in the world to go. She had Ruth's voice in her head saying, "Tomorrow, we'll figure out tomorrow." She had Ruth's hands showing her how to warm a bottle, how to swaddle a baby, how to keep going when everything inside you wanted to stop. It wasn't enough. It had to be enough. The years that followed were not a story she would tell her daughter when Grace was old enough to ask. They were not a story anyone wanted to hear, the grinding daily reality of poverty, the humiliations and compromises, the constant weight of knowing that one setback could send them both onto the street. She worked at a laundromat for the first year, folding other people's clothes while Grace slept in a car seat beside the industrial dryers. She moved into a rented room above a convenience store, a space so small she could touch both walls at once, with a hot plate for a kitchen and a shared bathroom down the hall. She worked nights at a diner after the laundromat closed, taking orders until midnight while a neighbor watched Grace, an elderly Vietnamese woman named Mrs. Nguyen, who charged $2 an hour and taught Grace her first words in 2 languages. She applied for community college when Grace was 18 months old, sitting through nursing classes while Grace was in the campus daycare, then studying textbooks on the bus and in the break room at work, and in the 15 minutes between when Grace fell asleep and when exhaustion claimed her too. She failed anatomy the first time. She passed it the second time. She failed nothing else. She became a nurse in 2001, 6 years after Grace was born, walking across a stage in a borrowed white uniform, while her daughter, now in first grade, sat in the audience and clapped so hard her hands turned red. She thought about Ruth in that moment, about what Ruth would say if she could see her now, and she heard Ruth's voice as clearly as if she were standing beside her. "I was wondering when you'd get here." She took a job at a hospital in Memphis, far enough from Calvary that she never had to think about her parents, close enough that the accent still sounded like home. She was good at the work. It turned out, she had Ruth's calm in a crisis, Ruth's ability to make patients feel seen. She advanced from floor nurse to charge nurse-to-nurse manager over 15 years, and she bought a house with a yard for Grace and a porch swing that creaked just like the one on Birch Street. And she filled it with books and warmth and the deliberate construction of the childhood she wished she had been given. Grace grew up knowing she was loved, knowing she was wanted, knowing that her mother had fought for her before she was even born. She knew the outlines of the story: homeless at 16, the church, the woman who helped, the struggle afterward. But she didn't know the details, the sharp edges, the moments that still woke Melissa at 3 a.m. with her heart pounding. She knew her mother didn't talk to her grandparents, didn't talk about them. Changed the subject when Grace asked questions about where she came from. She accepted this as a child because children accept what they're given. She questioned it as a teenager because questioning was what teenagers did. She stopped asking as a young adult because she understood, finally, that some doors stayed closed for a reason. But she never stopped wondering. She never stopped wanting to know. Grace was 27 years old when she asked the question that changed everything. She was visiting for Thanksgiving, standing in her mother's kitchen cutting carrots for the stuffing, and she said it casually, almost offhandedly. "Mom, I've been thinking about having kids, and I keep wondering, what if there's something in my family history I need to know? Medical stuff. And I realized I don't even know if your parents are still alive." Melissa set down the knife she was holding. She looked at her daughter, at this woman who had grown from the terrified life inside her belly into someone confident and kind and curious, someone who deserved better than a mother who ran from her own history. And she said, "I don't know either. I haven't spoken to them in 27 years. The conversation that followed lasted until midnight, long after the turkey was cold and the stuffing forgotten. Melissa told Grace everything, the whole story, start to finish, things she had never spoken aloud to anyone since Ruth died. She told her about Marcus and his lies. She told her about her father's fist and her mother's silence. She told her about the church and Ruth and the 7 months of hiding, the birth, the death, the years of building from nothing. Grace listened. She cried. She held her mother's hand across the kitchen table and said she was sorry. She was so sorry. She had never known. How could she have known? And then she said something Melissa didn't expect. She said, "I think you should find out. I think you should find out if they're alive, what happened to them. I think you need to know." Melissa said no at first. She said she had closed that chapter of her life. She had moved on. She had built something good from the wreckage they had left her in. She said she didn't owe them anything, not her presence, not her attention, not even her curiosity. But the question lodged itself somewhere inside her, in the space between her ribs, where old pain still lived, and it wouldn't let go. She found herself awake at 4 a.m., typing her father's name into search engines. Scrolling through results for Earl Dawson in Calvary, Tennessee. She found an obituary for her mother, dated 2014. Darlene Dawson, age 66, survived by her husband, Earl. A brief service was held at the Presbyterian Church. In lieu of flowers, donations could be made to the Calvary Public Library. Melissa read the obituary 3 times. She felt something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite relief, some complicated knot of emotion she couldn't untangle. Her mother was dead, had been dead for 8 years, and she hadn't known, hadn't been told, hadn't been listed as a survivor because she had been erased from the family entirely. Her father was still alive. The search told her that much. Earl Dawson, 77, still listed at the same address on Birch Street. The yellow house, the porch swing, the dogwood tree. She couldn't picture him at 77. And couldn't imagine the rigid foreman she remembered softened by age, but she found herself thinking about him at odd moments during her commute, during quiet shifts at the hospital, during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come. She thought about what Ruth had taught her about forgiveness, about how it wasn't a gift you gave to someone else, but a weight you set down for yourself. She thought about Grace's face when she asked about medical history, about the family her daughter would never know. She thought about the 27 years of silence, the decades of wondering that must have happened on both sides, the questions that would never be answered if she didn't ask them now. She drove to Calvary on a Saturday morning in March, telling Grace she was going to visit an old friend, not ready to explain where she was really going or why. The drive took 4 hours, and she spent most of it trying to remember the route, trying to recognize landmarks that had changed or disappeared entirely. The paper mill was closed now, she saw as she approached town, its buildings gutted and dark, a chain-link fence surrounding the ruins like they were embarrassed. Main Street had shrunk, storefronts empty, the hardware store still there but looking tired. May's Diner was gone, replaced by a Dollar General. The Baptist Church had expanded. The Presbyterian Church looked the same, and St. Catherine's, she slowed as she passed it. St. Catherine's had been torn down, a parking lot in its place, no sign that it had ever existed at all. She parked on Birch Street in front of the yellow house that wasn't yellow anymore, that had faded to something closer to gray, the paint peeling. So the porch sagging, the dogwood tree in the front yard dead and skeletal against the winter sky. The porch swing was gone. The windows were dark. The whole house had the look of something abandoned, something waiting to fall, and Melissa sat in her car for 15 minutes, trying to make herself get out, trying to make herself walk to the door, trying to make herself knock. She thought about leaving. She thought about driving back to Memphis and telling Grace she had tried, he wasn't there, some things couldn't be fixed. But Ruth's voice was in her head again, the way it always was at the moments she most needed direction, and Ruth was saying, "Tomorrow, we'll figure out tomorrow." So she got out of the car. She walked to the porch. She knocked on the door. The man who answered was her father and not her father. Sanji's skeleton wearing her father's face, shrunken and hollow, where he had once been broad and strong. He was in a wheelchair, she saw, one leg amputated below the knee, his hands trembling with what might have been age, or might have been Parkinson's, or might have been both. He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes clouded but still sharp, still carrying that assessing gaze she remembered from childhood. And then he said her name, Melissa. He said it like a question and an answer at once, like he had been waiting 27 years to say it, like he couldn't believe she was real. She didn't know what she had expected. Anger, maybe, or denial, or that same cold fury that had driven her out of this house when she was 16. What she got instead was something worse, something harder to navigate. His face crumpled. his eyes filled with tears. He reached out one trembling hand toward her and he said, "You came back. I didn't think you would ever come back. The house was a ruin. That was the only word for it. The inside matched the outside. Years of neglect piled on years of decline, dishes in the sink, dust on every surface. The smell of old age and illness, and a life that had shrunk down to the space between a hospital bed in the living room and a television that was always on." There was a home health aide who came 3 times a week, Earl explained, but she only stayed an hour, just long enough to check his vitals and help him bathe and make sure he hadn't died in the night. His voice was thin, nothing like the booming authority she remembered, and he kept looking at her as if she might disappear, as if she were a hallucination he didn't want to end. He asked her to sit down. He asked if she wanted coffee. He asked where she had been all these years, what she had done, who she had become. She told him. Not everything, not the church, not Ruth, not the worst of the early years, but enough. She told him about nursing school and the hospital in Memphis and the house with the porch swing. She told him about Grace. That made him cry again. The information that he had a granddaughter, a 27-year-old woman he had never met, never known about, never held as a baby. He asked if he could see a picture. She showed him one on her phone, Grace at her college graduation, cap and gown, that smile that was so much like Melissa's. He held the phone with shaking hands and stared at the picture for a long time, and then he said, "She looks like your mother. She looks just like your mother." They talked for 3 hours. Voiced circles within circles, approaching the central question and retreating from it, neither of them willing to say what needed to be said. Melissa learned that her mother had died of cancer, slowly, over 2 years, and that she had asked for Melissa at the end, had called for her daughter in the delirium of her final days. She learned that Earl had looked for her once, a private investigator in 2002, but the trail had gone cold and he had given up. She learned that he had been alone since Darlene died, truly alone, the neighbors checking on him out of obligation rather than affection, the town he had lived in for 50 years, treating him like a stranger. She learned that the mill had closed in 2008 and taken his pension with it, that he was living on Social Security and slowly selling off everything he owned, and that the house would probably go to the bank after he died. And then, finally, because she couldn't leave without asking, she said, "Why?" She said, "Why did you do it?" She said, "I was 16 years old and pregnant and scared, and you hit me and threw me out and didn't look for me for 8 years. Why?" Earl was quiet for a long time. The television murmured in the background, some game show with bright colors and canned laughter. Outside, a car passed on Birch Street, the sound of its engine fading into the afternoon silence. And then he said, "I was ashamed." He said, "I was ashamed of you, and I was ashamed of myself, and I didn't know how to be anything else." He said, "I thought if I could make you disappear, the shame would disappear too. But it didn't. It never did." He said, "I've been ashamed every day for 27 years. It wasn't enough." Melissa knew it wasn't enough, knew that 4 sentences couldn't account for a childhood lost, a mother who had watched and done nothing, 27 years of wondering if she was even worth looking for. But she looked at this shrunken man in his wheelchair, this ruin of the father who had terrified her, and she saw something she hadn't expected to see. She saw that he had already been punished. She saw that the world had extracted from him everything she might have wanted to take herself, his strength, his pride, his wife, his health, his future. She saw that there was nothing left to break, and Ruth's voice was in her head again saying, "Forgiveness isn't something you give to the person who hurt you. It's something you give to yourself." She said, "I'm not ready to forgive you." She said, "I don't know if I'll ever be ready." She said, "But I'm here, and I might come back. And if you want to meet your granddaughter, I can make that happen." Earl nodded. He wiped his eyes with the back of his trembling hand. He said, "That's more than I deserve." He said, "Thank you." She left Calvary that afternoon and drove back to Memphis, and she called Grace from the car and told her everything. The house, her father, the wheelchair, the years of decline, the confession that wasn't quite a confession. Grace was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Do you want me to meet him?" And Melissa said, "Only if you want to." And Grace said, "I think I do." They went together 3 weeks later, Melissa and Grace in Grace's car because the drive was easier with company and because some things you didn't face alone. Earl cried again when he saw Grace, cried harder than he had when he saw Melissa. And Grace was patient with him in a way that surprised Melissa, asking questions about her grandmother, about the family history, about the medical information she had originally come seeking. Earl told her about heart disease on his side, about the diabetes that had cost him his leg, about Darlene's cancer and her mother's stroke. He told her about the house they had lived in before Birch Street, about the honeymoon he and Darlene had taken to Gatlinburg, about the baby he and Darlene had lost before Melissa was born, a boy, stillborn at 8 months, something they had never recovered from and never spoken about. Grace held his hand while he talked. Melissa watched from the doorway, not sure where she fit in this new configuration, not sure what she was supposed to feel. They started to visiting once a month, then twice a month. Grace brought dinner sometimes, casseroles and soups that could be reheated easily, things an old man with one leg and shaking hands could manage alone. Melissa hired a cleaning service to come through the house, paid out of her own pocket, never telling Earl what it cost. They talked about moving him to Memphis, to an assisted living facility where Grace could visit more easily, where he wouldn't be alone in a dying town surrounded by memories of everything he had lost. Earl resisted at first, said he couldn't leave Calvary, said this was where Darlene was buried, said he needed to stay. But his health kept declining. Another fall, another hospitalization, another close call that could have been the last one. He moved to Memphis in October, to a facility 20 minutes from Melissa's house. A clean room with a window that looked out on a garden, staff who knew his name and checked on him 3 times a day. Grace visited every Sunday. Melissa visited twice a week, sitting beside his bed, reading the newspaper aloud when his eyes were too tired, listening to stories about a past she had missed, a family history she was finally being allowed to learn. They never talked about the night he hit her, not directly. But he apologized once, on a Tuesday evening, when the light was golden and the garden was full of roses, and he said it without prompting. I'm sorry for all of it. I should have been the father you deserved." And Melissa nodded, and she held his hand, and she didn't say she forgave him because she still wasn't sure she did, but she sat with him. She kept coming back, and that, she thought, was something. Earl died on a Friday morning in January, peacefully in his sleep, with Melissa sitting in the chair beside his bed and Grace asleep on the small couch across the room. The nurse came in to check his vitals and found that he was gone, and Melissa sat there for a long time afterward, holding his hand that was still warm, thinking about all the years between them, all the words that had been said and not said, all the ways they had hurt each other and tried to heal. She didn't feel the grief she had expected. She felt something more complicated, a mix of sorrow and relief, and something that might have been the beginning of peace. She called the funeral home. She signed the paperwork. She made the arrangements for a burial in Calvary beside Darlene, because that was what he had wanted, and because it was the last thing she could give him. The funeral was small. A few neighbors from Calvary, people who remembered Earl from the mill, a cousin Melissa had never met. Grace stood beside her at the graveside, holding her hand the way Melissa had held Ruth's hand so many years ago, and when the minister finished speaking and the casket was lowered into the ground, Melissa thought about all the people who were supposed to be there and weren't. Her mother, Ruth, the brother she had never known, the family she might have had if things had gone differently. She thought about St. Catherine's, now a parking lot, and she thought about the woman who had saved her life in that abandoned church, and she hoped that wherever Ruth was, she knew how the story had ended. She hoped Ruth was proud. After the funeral, Melissa and Grace drove through Calvary one more time, pushed down Main Street and past the empty storefronts and the church that was just a memory now. They stopped at the cemetery where Ruth was buried, the numbered marker replaced now with a real headstone that Melissa had paid for years ago, white marble with Ruth's name and dates and a single line underneath. She gave when she had nothing. They stood there in the January cold, and Melissa told Grace about Ruth in a way she never had before, about the wool blanket and the camp stove and the tea that was supposed to fix everything. Grace listened. She cried. And then she said, "Mom, I want you to know something. I want you to know that you did it. You survived. You built a life. You raised me. You're the strongest person I've ever known." Melissa looked at her daughter. At this woman who had been a terrified possibility growing inside her when she climbed through that church window, who had been a newborn screaming in her arms while Ruth was dying somewhere across town, who had been the reason she kept going through every exhausted midnight and every humiliating setback and every moment when giving up would have been so much easier. She thought about all the people who had told her, directly or indirectly, that her life was over when she got pregnant at 16. She thought about the people who had thrown her away, discarded her like trash, assumed she would fail. And she thought about Ruth, who had looked at her in the moonlight of that abandoned church and said, "Well, I was wondering when you'd get here," as if Ruth had known all along, as if she had been waiting for exactly this moment, exactly this girl, exactly this story that was still unfolding. If you're watching this right now, if you're in the middle of your own impossible situation, your own abandoned church, your own cold November night with nowhere to go, I want you to know something. I want you to know that the people who throw you away do not get to decide what you're worth. The people who failed you do not get to write your ending. You are still here. You are still breathing. And as long as you are breathing, the story isn't over. Tomorrow we'll figure out tomorrow. Tonight, rest. You've earned it. Melissa drives back to Memphis with Grace, asleep in the passenger seat. The Tennessee hills rolling past in the darkness, the road unspooling ahead of her like a promise she doesn't have to keep alone. She thinks about the church that isn't there anymore, and the woman who saved her, and the daughter who made it all worth fighting for. She thinks about forgiveness as a process, not an event, something she's still working on, something she may never fully complete. She thinks about all the years behind her and all the years still ahead, the granddaughter Grace might give her someday, the stories that are still waiting to be told. And she smiles, just a little, just enough. Not quite peace, but the beginning of it, the ghost of it, something growing in the place where the pain used to be, stubborn and green and reaching toward the light.